Welcome to a new NHL playoff edition of Inside the Lab. I'm your host, Joe Holka, analyst here at Fantasy Labs. We have a very special show for you guys today, talking some playoff hockey. As always, Sean Newsham joins me at PSUFans2 on Twitter. We were actually supposed to have Jake Myers on the show today, but he informed us that his internet connection actually mirrored his favorite team, the Washington Capitals, in playoffs. So we won't have Jake today. This is our second time recording this because we lost Jake about halfway through. But Sean, how are you doing, man? You ready to knock this out?
Yeah, I'm pretty excited for our second go through here. I'm looking forward. I haven't got a couple days off here before the playoffs start to recharge my batteries a little bit. So looking forward for playoff hockey. I mean, nothing beats it out there. So I can't wait to start watching some playoff games.
Yeah, it's going to be great. Playoff hockey is awesome. Getting to play playoffs on DraftKings. It's been kind of a little lull the past couple of weeks as we've been dealing with so many guys that have just been sitting and stuff like that. So it'd be nice to see these guys going full out and kind of see some of these guys, hopefully some of them a little bit rested, because playoffs is a grind, as you know, Sean. So is there any big differences that kind of jump out to you as far as DFS in the regular season and in playoffs?
I know Jake did some research and he was going to touch on it, so I guess I'll just get through what he found. Yeah. He found that there wasn't many differentials between regular season hockey and playoff hockey. He found that there's about like 1.5 more blocks per game or 1.5 blocks per game per team less, I believe, in the playoffs, and then there's about a half a shot less per team in the playoffs. So you see a little bit less peripheral stats in the playoffs, but the thing is that you need to realize is that playoff hockey, the perception is that there's a lot more block shots in the playoffs and less shots on goal. And there's ends up being slightly more block shots, but slightly less shots on goal. But what happens is there ends up being more time played in each game, so it's factored a little bit more. But the difference between playoff hockey and regular season hockey in terms of actual stats being produced isn't that great from what we've seen in our sample for the last couple years. But what you do find is you find guys on the second and third lines, the depth players generally have a higher plus-minus in terms of their point production than the guys on the top line, who have a generally lower and a negative plus-minus from the regular season stats. So what you find in the playoffs is the depth guys generally produce a little bit more because they're expected to pick up the load a little bit more for the top guys, who get locked down a little bit more in the playoffs by opposition's top D lines and top D pairings.
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit before on some other shows as far as certain defensive centermen, kind of shutdown centermen, can impact that first line. I think that there's probably an argument that is even more kind of emphasized in the playoffs. So, like, do you find yourself attacking like the second option or the second line on teams, especially in playoffs, or is it pretty similar to the regular season there too?
You do see that generally in the playoffs, the teams will find the top D pairings and top D defensive lines will generally try to match up as much as possible. So, like, for example, a team like Boston with Patrice Bergeron line, right, they will generally get their matchup they want against the opposition's top offensive line every game. So you'll see that in some series. Now, some series like the Toronto-Washington one, which we'll talk about first, I believe, they don't have a top defensive pairing or top D line per se on Toronto. The Nazem Kadri line is their top line, but it's not the biggest shutdown line of all time compared to the Bergeron line, and they don't have a top defensive pairing. So you will see that they will try to draw the matchups they want throughout the playoffs, especially on home ice, and you'll see that reflected in stats and the matchups throughout the games.
Yeah, it's definitely a case-by-case basis as far as kind of avoiding those shutdown centermen. But yeah, as always today, guys, the plan is to kind of bring you through our process, but just highlight the great tools we have at Fantasy Labs for NHL. So we're going to talk specifically about the Eastern Conference in this show, and then the next show will be on the Western Conference games. So the series we're going to talk about, Toronto, Washington, Columbus, Pittsburgh, New York, Montreal, and Boston, Ottawa. So those are the 4 series we're going to go through today. We're going to bring you through some scouting reports. We're going to bring you through some of the trends, kind of some specific, kind of more narrow trends with some smaller sample sizes, but I think there's still kind of value at looking at some of those unique splits. And we'll start with Toronto and Washington. How's that sound, Sean?
Sounds great. Get right into it, the big boys.
Yeah, I know, right? So I think that probably the best team storyline is probably Washington, honestly. I mean, they've won 10 division titles and qualified for the playoffs 26 times. They've won the President's Trophy 3 times, including this season, and they've only advanced to the Cup final once. So similar to Jake's internet, what do you see that kind of playing out this year? Do you think they finally get over the hump?
I got to think they get over the hump, but the Eastern Conference is really difficult, especially their division. So it's a spot. The thing is Washington's a much different team from what they used to be. Alexander Ovechkin now plays both sides of the ice most games, and especially in the playoffs, you expect him to play a defensive game. He does still take his days off sometimes, but he's just a much different player. Like, you watch it in his style and just how he plays, and he plays both sides of the ice a bit more than he used to. I got to think they get through. They have a great depth. Their third line's even a really solid line, and they really have a good depth on the blue line. I mean, when you have Kevin Shattenkirk and like Matt Niskanen, and you have John Carlson, and you even have a young guy like Dmitry Orlov and whatnot. So you got a great depth team, and they really are a really, really good team. So I would expect them to finally get over the hump and maybe make it to it. But they never get out of that second round. That second round is always daunting them. I think the matchup with Toronto is a pretty good matchup for them. Toronto generally likes to give up a lot of shots and likes to take a lot of shots, so it's a more free-flowing game that you'll see with Toronto. And I don't think they have the shutdown pair that's going to shut down the top line like if they drew Boston with Patrice Bergeron. So I think for Washington, drawing Toronto is a better matchup for them. Granted, Boston has lost to Washington, I believe, 9 straight games. So maybe that's not the case. But I think going into the playoffs, from Boston's standpoint, I would rather see Toronto. And I think you should see some decent score lines. And I think the over-under in that series should be one of the highest every night that they play.
Yeah, I agree. Jake talked about how he was pretty excited that his team got Toronto and not Boston. So it's interesting that you say that. I mean, Toronto, they might be the most intriguing team. They kind of limp into playoffs. They did kind of make it interesting at the end, but their second playoff berth in the last 12 seasons. So, I mean, they've got some really exciting young players. I mean, the rookies accounted for 304 of their points. And I mean, just the guy, like, we're going to talk a bit about Austin Matthews, Mitch Marner, Nylander. So, I mean, do you think that Babcock is going to rely heavily on these guys, or do you think that kind of the playoffs is just a different animal in general, and we should kind of temper our expectations a bit on what they did in the regular season?
I think the expectations need to be tempered a little bit. However, Toronto doesn't have a choice. All their key players, for the most part, are really young and are generally they have a lot of rookies. You see guys like Nylander, Matthews, Connor Brown, Mitch Marner. All these guys are their key guys. So it's not like they can sit there and sit all these guys or reduce any of their minutes. If these guys don't play, they have no one to go out. So I think you're going to have to see, because they're drawing a really difficult match with Washington. We've already discussed their great back end, and with Braden Holtby and Ned. They're going to be a really difficult team to break down as much as you'd expect them to be. However, you'll see teams like the Ovechkin line generally gives up a lot of shots and a lot of block shots when they're out on the ice because they draw top lines. So you might want to play a Nazem Kadri type line, and especially in the home games, you're going to have like the Tyler Bozak, James Van Riemsdyk line that's been pretty productive for the last month or so that could really go out there and produce well at a reduced ownership and reduced price tag.
Yeah, we talked about this before, but I mean, just kind of looking for these players. I mean, even just past that first line, because I mean, just the ownership in general this year has been skewed pretty much towards that Matthews Nylander side, but Kadri is kind of slightly below that tier, and kind of looking at their lines, it might be a better option, but we'll see. Kind of so let's jump into like some of these unique splits. So Toronto. And then we'll look at how they've done specifically against Washington. Like, it is a smaller sample, but we'll see kind of who has performed the best. We'll see if kind of some of these names pop here. So,
sorry, Joe.
What were you going to say?
Yeah, what we were talking about earlier is like sample size is obviously a very important thing in terms of a DFS perspective. But you don't get very many samples where it's exactly against one team. Now, Toronto and Washington didn't play as many times within the year because they're not within the same division, but some of these teams played each other 4 times throughout the year, so they are going to have a small sample, but within that sample, it's actually going to be somewhat indicative of what you're going to see throughout the series, because you have an exact replication of that team playing against this team. So it's not something you need to look at totally, but you might be able to find some good matchups or some good situations where maybe people produced at a good clip. Like if you look at this, you see Mitch Marner, James Van Riemsdyk produced a really good production in the couple games they had against Washington.
Yep.
So that sits there, and you put that situation out. Well, maybe there's a mismatch, and there's a reason that Mitch Marner and James Van Riemsdyk are really producing against Washington, whereas the guys like Austin Matthews and Nazem Kadri didn't have as big of games.
Yep.
So it's definitely a situation where you want to look at that and figure out for yourself if you think that's a relevant data point or not.
Yeah, I mean, that's the best part about these trends in general is you can kind of customize them to what you think's important, and then it's just going to go right over to your models when you go and build lineups. So I think that we've covered Toronto pretty well. Let's touch quickly on Ovechkin and the Capitals a little bit more here, though. We've mentioned before on previous shows that the correlation between Ovechkin and his line mates, Backstrom and Oshie, is probably one of the strongest of any of the top lines kind of in the league. So do you think that there's still leverage in like paying up for all three of these guys in tournaments, even though you're going to kind of have to go stars and scrubs? Or do you think it's worth it? Do you think it's something we can do in cash? Or what are your thoughts on kind of the top line in Washington, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, their correlation is very evident within this article. If you look through their correlation throughout the year, they really do have great correlation between themselves. That said, they're going to be really difficult to pay up for all of them. In the playoffs, you don't see as much value as you do in the regular season. You don't see a bunch of cheap rookies that are on the slate that weren't there before. So it's going to be really difficult. You'd have to get creative to get those guys in. However, they're a very valid option. What you do look at in the playoffs is, as we alluded to at the beginning, sometimes you see second lines, third lines produce a better plus minus than what they did in this regular season in terms of their point totals. Mm-hmm. So you might want to play the Justin Williams, Evgeny Kuznetsov, and Marcus Johansson line in tournaments because you can get them at a massive reduction in ownership compared to the Ovechkin line. Yep. And maybe you can sit there and pick the game where they go off and carry Washington to the win.
Yeah, agreed. I think that if you can kind of grab some of those ownership things and be able to kind of grab those lower tier, but right under the top tier, I think there's a lot of kind of a lot of value in that. I think this series is really interesting in general because this is probably one of Washington's last real chances with Ovechkin fully in his prime. They're losing some guys as far as restricted free agents next year. Kuznetsov, Orlov, Burakovsky, like they're all restricted free agents. They're going to have to pay these guys. So I think a lot of their kind of their top players in this core, this might be one of their last chances at it. So moving on to the next series, Sean, what are your initial thoughts as far as Columbus and Pittsburgh?
I think you're going to see a series that's somewhat more open. Pittsburgh's had to play a more open style of game since they've lost Chris Letang and some of their defensemen. So their defense isn't as great. So they've been outscoring people recently, and they've given up quite a few goals too. So I think you might see a series that's a little bit more free-flowing than you would generally think of for a playoff series. And you got guys like Justin Schultz, who's really stepped up in Chris Letang's absence, who could be a very viable option most nights. And then you got guys like Connor Sheary and Jake Gunsel, who've been great playing along the wings with Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin all year. Pittsburgh's sort of been in a spot, same with Columbus, where they've been able to rest guys throughout the last couple weeks of the season. Like Malkin's been injured, but I don't think it's that serious, and he's just not been playing because the games were pretty meaningless. So you got guys like this that are going to come back in. Like Evgeny Malkin on 2 weeks rest could be something that's very valuable and could really hurt the opposition. You got guys that are going to come in with fresh legs that have had a couple weeks to recover from regular season knocks, and they could really come in and play well in the playoffs.
Yeah, this is probably my favorite series in the Eastern Conference. I think it's going to be really exciting. Like you have the Penguins' kind of high-flying offense, and then you got Sergei Bobrovsky on the other side. He's probably one of the favorites for the Vezina. So what are your thoughts as far as the Letang injury? I think that could be something that's definitely going to impact this series. What are your thoughts on Letang, and kind of do you think they're going to be able to push through that?
Yeah, I think it's a massive injury. Like you losing Chris Letang is your best puck-moving defenseman, is your best defenseman overall. It's a massive issue. However, that said, they went through last year's playoffs and they had injuries to Chris Letang throughout the playoffs or suspensions. I forget which it was, but they were able to pick up the slack. Justin Schultz stepped in and they were able to not really miss a beat because I remember I forget what series it was, but they were the same team pretty much going forward. So it's insane to see when hockey players get injured, how the next guy up just picks up the slack a lot of the time. Granted, you're going to lose a little bit because obviously the puck moving ability that Chris Letang has won't be there, but they've been producing at a really good clip, and Chris Letang hasn't played most of the year. So guys like Ian Cole, Chad Ruhwedel, and these type of guys, they've really been stepping up well, and in their added minutes, they've been playing extremely well for Pittsburgh this year.
Yeah, for sure. I think this goaltending matchup is super interesting. Like we like Matt Murray quite a bit, most nights just because Pittsburgh gives up so many shots, and he's been pretty solid. And the scouting report that I did on him was pretty solid in general. Do you really like to play a guy like that, Sean? That's is going to have kind of that peripheral floor over a guy like Bobrovsky, that's probably middle of the pack as far as shots against.
Yeah, generally I would like to see my goalies to see some shots. So someone like Matt Murray, especially in their home games in Pittsburgh, it should be a spot where he sees quite a few shots on goal, and they should be a favorite to win most of those games. Murray's been really solid for Pittsburgh ever since last year when he led them to a cup, and it's insane to think that they're paying Marc-Andre Fleury the amount of money they are, and basically the reason they won the cup last year is because he wasn't playing. So Matt Murray's a really good valid option, especially every game that they're going to be in Pittsburgh in this series, because they should be a decent-sized favorite in the games in Pittsburgh, and he should see some shots. So he definitely should be a guy that you consider most nights.
Yeah, I kind of broke that down in the scouting report, kind of by money line in general, and he's produced the most value this season when they're a slight favorite, but he's also been really solid when kind of all over the board. There's a couple of these that I've looked at on goalies, and especially we're going to talk about Carey Price a bit later, where he's actually been better as a slight underdog. So that'll be kind of interesting. Let's jump back over to trends and kind of filter by these two teams here and see if there's anything that kind of pops as far as the Pittsburgh side. And then we can actually even just filter it by Columbus as well and see if there's any specific players, because they probably played each other a few more times than the last one that we looked at. So
yeah, with the divisional opponents, they've definitely played each other a bit more. As you can see, like some of the big guys for Pittsburgh haven't been stepping up in their games against Columbus. Like even a guy like Evgeny Malkin doesn't even show up because he's so low down on the plus-minus list. Like you have to scroll all the way down to the bottom. Look at those games against Columbus. Now, granted, it's only been 3 games. However, those 3 games, he really struggled.
And look at his ownership, too, in those games.
You got a guy that's 21% that's massively below his season average.
Yep.
Now, granted, it might just be because it was a small sample. However, maybe there's something more into it, or you think there's going to be something that could alter that. But, however, you have guys like Ian Cole who produced pretty well against them in those games. So you definitely need to look at this type of thing. You need to decide for yourselves whether you think it's a extremely valid piece of information or if you think it's something you should overlook. But it's definitely something you need to consider.
Yeah, I agree. Kind of looking at these smaller splits, like we said, we can kind of take it with a grain of salt, but like these like big time outliers as far as like their season expectation versus just this team, I think there's some value in that, especially kind of in playoffs. So that's interesting with Malkin. Anything else before we move on to the next series, Sean?
No, I think that was a good breakdown of that series. I agree with you. I think it should be a really fun series and it should be pretty solid.
Definitely. So the next series, we're going to look at the New York Rangers and the Montreal Canadiens. So another really interesting one as far as goaltenders, Carey Price, and then Henrik Lundqvist has actually played terribly in the Bell Center historically. So do you think there's any merit to that as far as Lundqvist and kind of gets psyched out when he's in Montreal?
I definitely think there is something that can be said with goalies. Skaters, for the most part, don't really buy into that type of stuff. But for goaltenders, it's all about their sight lines. It's the same thing with, like, three-point shooters in college basketball and NBA. Like, there's been some discussions about in the past where shooters in the college basketball tournament, when they end up in the Final Four and they end up playing in a football stadium, they have difficult time picking up their sight lines, so their shooting sometimes may be altered. I think the same can be said with goalie. If you're a goalie and you don't like the background or like sort of where your sight lines are in a stadium, it might impact you because for a goaltender, all your game is sight lines and how you see the puck. And if you can't pick up the puck well due to maybe the end board background is different or the seats are weird, it could really alter your game and really could alter your thing. Now, that said, it's not something I fully would look into, but it's definitely something I would buy in terms of a goalie.
Yeah, I mean, these two teams were only separated by 1 point in the standings, and Henrik's 4-9-2 with a 3.87 goals against average and .877 save percentage in the regular season, but he was pulled in for the team's 2014 playoff series. So he's had some struggles in the playoffs. So we'll see. He's been a guy that's really kind of put the Rangers on his back at times, but he's also kind of struggled as well. So maybe a little bit of a more high variance play. But yeah, I was just talking about with Carey Price before. He's actually been better, slightly better from a kind of a value perspective as an underdog. But in general, we're going to see lower ownership as these underdog goalies, but a little bit more value kind of up there. But he's been really, really good as they are the massive favorites, kind of in a smaller sample size. But he's had a ton of value as slight underdog. So we'll see kind of how these shake out and see if that kind of transfers over. But his ownership in general has been a lot lower in those games as well. So let's look at some of the players here for Montreal. You want to talk about Pacioretty a little bit, Sean, while I'm doing this?
Yeah, I think Max Pacioretty is a great play. He usually is. He's going to be given the most difficult matchups, but the Rangers don't really have a lockdown defensive line or offensive line. So they could see quite a few shots from Max Pacioretty. One of the best things about Pacioretty is he likes to shoot. He's generally near the top of the league in shots taken in season and per game. So it's definitely a guy that I like to consider. And if you look at this, his game logs against the Rangers, he's got 100% consistency, and he's got a great plus-minus. And in general, the entire Montreal team has a really good plus-minus in games against the Rangers. So it really indicates that they've been the better team in those games from a DFS perspective. Granted, it's not a massive total of games, but it's still an indication that there might be something there. I like that as well. I also like Shea Weber. Shea Weber over the last month of the season didn't even play in the last week. They've just sort of been giving him rest, and he's a guy that logs 28 minutes a game a lot of the time, but as you can see, he's only played one game since April started. Even during the end of March, he was only playing like 23, 24 minutes a game. Shea Weber's a guy that blocks a lot of shots, takes a lot of shots. He's a great peripheral guy from a DFS perspective. Mm-hmm. And as you can see, his price tag has not been as high as it once was. At the beginning of the year, he was in the mid to high sixes on DraftKings, and now he's at towards the end of the season, the mid-fives. So he's a guy that could be really good in the playoffs because he really produces well. The power play sends a lot of passes to him for one-timers where he just unloads his cannon of a shot.
Yep.
He's one of my favorite players to play for Montreal.
Yeah, I really like the Weber call. I think Pacioretty is solid. You got to really pay up for him. But as far as Weber, he's one of those guys that's going to get you those peripherals, I think. And paying up defensemen is something we typically do like to do. On the New York side, I did a scouting report on Derek Stepan as well. This is actually right after he snapped that 23 goalless game streak that he had going throughout the year. So it was a little bit kind of a while ago, but still, I think in general, Stepan has been dramatically better at home, and that's just something that I thought was kind of interesting because the Rangers have performed much better on the road this year. So do you think that kind of proficiency on the road as a team is something that could carry over to the playoffs?
Yeah, it could, because what might happen is at home they might draw him a more easier and favorable matchup, whereas on the road he might get matched up with a more difficult matchup. So it's definitely a situation where, based on the way that they go with their scouting reports and their game plan, he draws an easier matchup at home versus on the road. So it's definitely a situation where you want to consider something like that and might want to look at him harder when he's a home team and they're on their home ice.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Looking at some of these centermen, I think that Stepan in particular, there's not really a huge edge in targeting centermen as Vegas favorites, as this kind of showed us, versus underdogs. But basically, Stepan has been much better as a favorite for New York, so that's something to keep in mind. Let's look at these New York players before we move on quickly in trends. But any other kind of just thoughts in general on the series, Sean?
I'm expecting a close series here. I think both teams are very solid teams, and they ended up the season pretty close in their point totals, I believe, at the regular season. And the only reason New York's in this situation is because of the way that the series, or the way that the playoffs formatted now, which is terrible, by the way. But you have two really good teams that are probably two top five teams in the conference playing in the first round of the playoffs. So it's a spot where I think you're going to have openings on both sides, but I expect it to be a really contested series the entire way through.
Yeah, definitely. So these ownership kind of levels here, do you think that it's pretty flat on New York in general? It's not like there's like kind of one line that stands out. So it's really interesting that you say that. Let's move on though. Make sure we get through all four of these games here. The last series we're going to talk about the Boston Bruins and Ottawa Senators. So do you think that it's going to be a situation where we're talking about the Craig Anderson storyline here, or do you think that kind of the Carlson factor is going to be something we want to pay up for in our lineups?
I think Erik Karlsson is going to be a very important member of that series. I think he's the key to everything Ottawa does. If Erik Karlsson is the best player on the ice, they can win the games. If he's not, they're going to have a really difficult time winning games. He's been injured, but like I said, at the end of the regular season, so many of these injuries are just super flawed, and they're really not injuries, and guys are really just resting. Like if you look at Ottawa's lineup from yesterday, they ended up playing like 9 or 10 guys out of 20 who are not in their regular lineup. So I think it's definitely a person that you're going to want to consider. That said, Boston's going to have their lockdown defensive pair, so it's really going to be difficult to find. You're going to not want to target whichever line for Ottawa is getting matched up against Therese Bergeron line. So each of those games is going to be difficult. So you're going to want to look and see how these guys produce at home and on the road versus this team, because at home, Bergeron might get a different matchup than when he's on the road. So you might want to target the opposite sides of that. But Boston's banged up on the defensive end, so there could be some good value coming from the Ottawa side of things.
Yeah, I agree. Ottawa is kind of a unique team because, I mean, the Atlantic Division was pretty poor this season. That kind of explains, like, Ottawa's the only team. I mean, they finished second in their division or their conference, and despite a negative goal differential, and like no other team in the playoffs was in the red kind of in that category. So, I mean, that doesn't mean that there's not individuals that are kind of worth targeting, but I think in general, I think there could be some value with Ottawa. But how do you think that's going to work as far as Bergeron and Marchand? Do you think that they're players to target at home for that reason, as far as kind of shutting down that pairing, or do you like them a little bit better on the road typically?
Yeah, honestly, I think the Bergeron line and Bergeron by himself is one of the best plays in the playoffs. Like you just alluded to, the Ottawa team is not very good. They're second in their division. They're getting this home ice because of the way that this playoffs are, but I would probably argue Ottawa is the worst team in the playoffs, or the second worst team in the playoffs from the Eastern Conference, maybe even the entire playoffs. They're in the playoffs. I believe they got like 97 points or somewhere right around there, way below most of the other teams. The negative goal differential is a good indication that they aren't that great of a team. I think that you definitely are going to want to target Boston guys at home in this series, because I expect Boston to win this series, even though they are not the home team throughout the series. But I think Boston is the better team. However, that said, the Boston guys are banged up. I think you need to take a look at, if Torrey Krug and Brendan Carlo are not playing, someone like Zdeno Chara is really going to have to log a lot of minutes, and he does a good job with peripheral stats for Boston. And there's a possibility if Torrey Krug is out, Zdeno Chara might step onto the top power play unit, which would add even more value to him going into the series.
Yeah, Chara's interesting because I think he's one that you could see his peripherals kind of spike in playoffs. Like, he's a guy that, I mean, he's blocking 4 or so shots quite a bit, tailed off a little bit towards the end of the season. But I think Chara's an interesting one because he is super cheap, especially on DraftKings. So is there anyone else that you want to talk about? Is there any other value guys? Like, in general, like you said, there isn't a ton of value in playoffs that we typically see. But I think, like, the biggest problem is going to be able to play some of these studs. So is there anyone on Boston that stands out to you in that way, or not so much?
Yeah, I guess I'll go through the entire Eastern Conference, and we'll just name some guys that might be cheaper that could get some added value. We'll go team by team. So I think for Washington, that second line is really productive, along with someone like Andre Burakovsky. So if you want some value there, you think you can find them. Lars Eller's even produced in spots where he's gotten additional minutes throughout the year. For them on the defensive side, John Carlson's been sort of reduced price and reduced minutes because they brought in Kevin Shattenkirk. However, what they did is they moved John Carlson to the second power play unit. Granted, not ideal, but on the second power play unit, he's the focal point of it. They send a bunch of one-timers his way, and I think that he definitely has some value there. So that is Washington. They're playing Toronto. You can find guys like Connor Brown to be relatively cheap. I'm not sure if I'd really attack tons of the cheap guys for Toronto. It would depend what kind of minutes they're playing, who they're matched up against. But you got guys like Leo Komarov, Connor Brown, that generally will play 16 to 18 minutes a game. And then on the defense, you're going to have Nikita Zaitsev, who's been really good for them all year. And he could really produce at a decent clip in that playoff series, especially if he's matched up against a line like Ovechkin. He could maybe see some extra block shots throughout it.
Sure.
When you go to the Columbus-Pittsburgh series, Pittsburgh's not probably going to have tons of value. Most of their guys are priced up. You could find someone like Ian Cole on the back end, who we've talked about a little bit in the show. He produces at a decent clip against Columbus, and he blocks some shots, and you should be able to find him in the low 3Ks. So if you need a cheap guy, he's valid. For Columbus, we looked earlier, and Brandon Dubinsky has a really good track record this year against Pittsburgh. He's got 100% consistency rating against them. He produces at a good plus-minus against them. So he's a guy that you're going to get low ownership. Now, you see his average points per game here is against overall is 2.2. Against Pittsburgh, it's been 4.5 or right around there. Mm-hmm. So his games against Pittsburgh have been solid games. As you can see, he had a goal against them about a week and a half ago. Mm-hmm. So if you need that, you can go to him or like Boone Jenner, those type of guys. And then that's pretty much it for that series. If you move on to the the next series on the list, the Rangers Montreal series. Yeah. The Rangers, you might have guys like Brady Shea step up and play some minutes. They've been rotating their lines a bit, so it depends. But like someone like Pavel Buchnevich or Jimmy Vesey, they've been playing second line, give or take, on and off throughout the year. But for the most part, the Rangers guys aren't that expensive.
Sure.
If I'm looking at Montreal, I think you're going to have guys like Andrei Markov and Nathan Beaulieu should play some reasonable minutes on the back end. And Andrei Markov doesn't shoot a lot, but he does block a lot of shots, and I expect him to see his minutes really get increased throughout the playoffs because he's one of their most veteran defensemen. And then I think you can find some other guys on Montreal, like Philip Deneau has been playing the top line. He's relatively cheap, but doesn't shoot a lot. So you'll find guys like Andrew Shaw. Andrew Shaw generally sits in front of the net on the power play, rotates between the first and second unit over the last month or two. But he's a solid guy. And then Arturi Lehkonen has been pretty solid for them as well in terms of production. So you can find guys like this for cheap. And then in the last series, the Boston series, you're going to have guys like maybe Drew Stafford and Frank Vetrano stepping up at the top end. And then we've already talked about Zdeno Chara. If Torrey Krug ends up missing time and Zdeno Chara ends up on the top power play or just logging 28 minutes a game, he's going to be a guy you really want to consider in that series for Boston. And then the Ottawa side of things, Cody Ceci has been someone that has produced some block shots and has had actually a pretty solid point production lately for someone as cheap as he is. He won't get you tons of offensive stats. He's not going to come out there and score you a goal and get you 3 assists or anything like that. But Cody Ceci is a guy that you're probably going to be able to find for low $3,000 range who can go out there and have a solid production for you. So that's just a name of some guys. Now, what you need to do is you need to keep track of the playoffs. There's going to be injuries throughout the playoffs. And when there's injuries or there's ineffective play, guys are going to move up the depth charts and they're going to play more minutes or they're going to play different roles. So you need to really keep an eye out to sort of see the fluctuation between lines and when people step up into more advanced roles to find value throughout the slates in the playoffs, because that's really where the edge is going to be found.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think we talked about it earlier, but just in general, there's a lot of value in watching these games. There's some sports where you probably don't have to watch, but I think hockey, especially playoff time, just to get a feel for these series, I think there's a ton of value in that. I think it's definitely something that you guys should do. Who do you think the best bets are as far as from teams that are going to advance to the second round? I think probably Washington and Pittsburgh are favored, but I do really like Montreal and Boston on the other side. Well, what are your thoughts as far as guys to move on?
Yeah, that's honestly my projections as well. I would probably say I don't think the Columbus team is as good as they are. I think they just got hot at one point during the season that carried them throughout the season. I think Pittsburgh advances, and I think Washington also advances. And then on the other side of the thing, I think that Montreal-New York series is very intriguing. I think that could go either way. I do like Boston. I think Ottawa is one of the worst teams in the playoffs from both sides of the league, and I just don't think they're very good. And I think the Patrice Bergeron line can really just alter a playoff series and completely change it. So I like Boston, especially if Torrey Krug ends up being healthy and doesn't miss any time. So I prefer Boston, and the other series, like I said, is sort of a coin flip to me.
Yep. I think that's a really good point. I think in general, I think we've covered quite a bit today as far as these series. The next show is going to be on the Western Conference, but I think we're going to end it there for today. Everyone, thanks for listening. As always, please send any thoughts to the Fantasy Labs NHL Twitter account at Fantasy Labs NHL, or you can send it to either of our individual Twitter handles. You can find me at Joe Holka, and you can find Sean at PSU Fans 2. So thanks for listening. Good luck in playoff hockey DFS. Hope to catch up to you guys in the Western Conference show.